Good evening. I'm Veronica Higgs Cope, and on behalf of the Public Affairs Committee of the Georgia Association for Women Lawyers, I'd like to welcome you all to our legislative preview. GAL's mission is to enhance the welfare and development of women lawyers and to support their interests. For several years now, GAL has provided a forum for organizations that are in line with our mission to come and speak about their legislative agendas and goals for the upcoming session of the Georgia General Assembly. This year is no exception. We're honored again this year to have Troutman Sanders as our exclusive sponsor of the preview. As we all know, an informed membership and citizenry often leads to a civically engaged society. We're privileged today to hear from representatives of the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the YWCA, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, Greenlaw, the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association, MARTA, Georgia Watch, and Project South. So each presenter will have 5 minutes to present her agenda, his or her agenda, and after each presentation, we will open up the discussion to the audience for questions. So without further ado, we'll begin our program with a presentation from the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Allison Smith Burke is the Director of Public Policy and a lobbyist for the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, where she served since August 2005. She's worked in the domestic violence movement for over 12 years, including her tenure at the coalition and at the Northwest Georgia Family Crisis Center in Dalton, Georgia. Allison earned her Bachelor of Social Work and her Master of Social Work degrees at the University of Georgia. Allison has a special expertise in the area of public policy and systems advocacy, economic abuse, and economic security for survivors, and the intersection of domestic violence and child maltreatment. Allison is also a former Georgia Women's Policy Institute Fellow, where she served as leader of a team that helped to bring legislation that strengthens protections for elderly and disabled victims of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. In 2014, Allison was elected to serve on the Public Policy Committee of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. Please join me in welcoming Allison Smith Burke.
Thank you so much for having me. I know it's been a busy day after a long night last night, so I appreciate you guys taking time to come out. I'm with the Georgia Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Just to familiarize you with who we are and what we do, we're not a direct service organization. We are a coalition of domestic violence programs that are located throughout the state of Georgia, including 46 state-certified domestic violence shelters. And our role is to provide training and technical assistance to those who work directly with victims of domestic violence. But our second primary goal is to advance policies that help survivors of domestic violence achieve safety and justice. And so in that capacity, I serve as a lobbyist for the coalition, and we engage in legislative advocacy, but also policy and systems advocacy. So for example, we may help file an amicus brief on certain cases, or we try to influence departmental policy within the state of Georgia. So this year we're going to lift something really heavy down at the legislature, and that's the issue of firearms. But we like to say that this is not a firearms bill, it's a public safety bill. To give you a framework here, domestic violence and firearms are a deadly combination. We have tons of research that show that when you introduce a firearm into a domestic violence situation, the risk of homicide goes up 500%. We know this for sure. Where Georgia ranks in all this, we rank 8th worst in the nation for the rate at which women are killed by men. And in partnership with another statewide organization, we survey the landscape of domestic violence-related homicides throughout the state of Georgia through, quite frankly, a pretty rudimentary service, a media clipping service, because we don't have any other consistent way of gathering that information. So we tabulate all of those domestic violence homicides, and we do more research on them and try to figure out the means of death. And consistently, from year to year, the means of death is the means of death in 65 to 75% of the domestic violence related deaths each year. I'll skip over that just for time's sake. We really want to emphasize that this is a public safety issue, and I say that because based on a study of mass shootings, we find that about 57% of them actually stem from a domestic violence related incident. And you'll often see that when you see a mass homicide happen in public, when they start looking at, well, who is this person that committed this homicide? What's their story? Where are they from? Oftentimes you find that there's a root in domestic violence. And in fact, in these cases, 28% of the perps had a prior domestic violence charge. When we look at just Georgia domestic violence firearms deaths, we pulled out those firearms deaths between 2010 and 2015. There were 529 deaths done by firearm. This came from 347 incidents. 129 of them were murder-suicides, and 10% of them were multiple homicides. So here's some of the folks that are killed besides intimate partners. You have children, you have parents of intimate partner, you have adult children. There's just a lot of loopholes in state law as far as where batterers get access to firearms. Every state around us has passed a law. And when I speak of a law, we're talking about a federal law that the Lautenberg Amendment, which was attached to the Gun Control Act back in the mid-90s. It essentially states that certain domestic violence offenders cannot possess a firearm. It's against federal law. But it's very difficult to get those laws enforced on a state level because technically federal agents have to enforce those laws. We have found some creative ways to do it. But the best way to do it is the way the other states around us have done it, which is pass a state law which codifies the federal law, and it makes it just as clear as day. It gives the authority for law enforcement to act, and it gives the authority for judges to act. The ways in which our law that we will be proposing is different is that it also includes a relinquishment provision, which basically states that if you're subject to a temporary protective order that meets the qualifications, then you will have your firearms removed from you for the period, the time period of the order. A family violence misdemeanor conviction means that you never get your guns back. We know this is going to go over really, really well in the legislature. No, we actually have talked with a lot of legislators so far, and they do understand this issue and have given us some promising comments about it, have some folks who are really interested in it because it really is an issue of public safety. It's an issue of public safety to law enforcement, quite frankly. We've seen that other states that have passed similar laws have seen a reduction in domestic violence related homicides. So we want to get that same law passed here in Georgia. So this is my contact information. I could speak for many, many, many more hours on this topic. It's really hard to condense it down into 5 minutes. But we basically just see it as a public safety issue. We hope actually to get the support of a lot of registered gun owners because this is just common sense legislation. I'd be happy at this time to take any questions. Yes.
Is there any push for a longer-term gun ban for perpetrators who are subject to TPO but not any criminal charges? Because if the TPO, I mean, most people don't extend it to get a 3-year or permanent TPO. They just get the 12-month TPO and then that expires. So then the person can get their guns back after 12 months. And I feel like they're probably in a new relationship where they're committing domestic violence by that point.
Sure. Yeah, no, what we're proposing is going to be pretty much exactly like the federal law with the exception of the only addition would be the relinquishment piece so that we require them to relinquish. Other states around us have passed a similar law with sometimes watered down a bit, for example, on the lifetime ban on misdemeanants. Some folks or some states have reduce that to a 10-year ban post-conviction. So we may have some room to negotiate, but no, we don't see us getting asking for any more than just the term under which someone's subject to the protective order. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So the question was is there any movement behind maybe adding to extending the period of time under which someone who's subject to a TPO cannot have a firearm, because typically those are 12-month orders, and after that 12 months, that person may be in another abusing someone else, essentially. Let me get to you, and then you.
How do you, or how does kind of the law you guys are trying to pass handle enforcement of the relinquishment element? Does that look like probation officers doing searches of homes? Does that look like the victims having to report whether or not the offender is in possession of firearms? Or how exactly do we get offenders to, one, identify that they have a firearm, and then two, relinquish it?
So those are some weeds that we hope to negotiate with a sponsor and see what they want. What we want from the outset is a voluntary, like signing an affidavit saying that I've submitted over all firearms. Depending on how palatable it is, we may ask for a search for those weapons ahead of time, based on interviews with victims to see if they indicate that there is a firearm. We're really trying to play it by ear with the sponsor. I think though we're prepared to put a lot of energy into enforcement and writing of protocols to back up this legislation, because in some states where they have not, where they've just passed the legislation and not really drawn up any clear guidelines about who's responsible for what, when, and where, particularly when you're talking about folks who are subject to a protective order and they get their gun back at some point. So it will be very critical for us to draw out specific protocols with communities, and those are things that don't happen in the legislation. But yes, yeah, and it. I will say that we do have some communities in Georgia, for example. Okay, so the protective order process works where you get an ex parte order first, or an emergency order, and then you have the full hearing. It's set for a hearing so that the respondent can respond to allegations or what's in the petition. And federal law only applies at the point where the respondent has had a chance to be heard, so after due process. We do have some counties in Georgia, however, who issue who when they get an ex parte, they send sheriffs out to serve notice to the respondent, and at that time they pick up weapons. We know that happens in Hall County on protective orders, and I think that there's been some appeals court ruling on that, because it obviously has been challenged, and it's been upheld. That practice has been upheld, although I haven't read it or had an attorney read the appeals, but it seems to have stood up. But there is some consternation, though, that I feel, honestly, if we can speak frankly, about asking someone to, on their honor, give up their firearms. That's, But the more we conjure up visions of law enforcement coming into someone's house and taking their firearms, that drives a certain segment of folks at the Capitol a little off.
So do you have data on how many times when law enforcement goes to respond to a domestic violence call, there ends up being injury to the or shooting or anything like that during the call, because that might be helpful?
It would be great to have that data, but we have 159 counties and 300 and something police or law enforcement jurisdictions, and even the GBI, who they're the ones that collect that, they even have problems getting that information. But we are able to say, based on our examination of domestic violence, firearm homicides, how often police were there when guns were fired. So, in other words, how many incidents were there where law enforcement were in danger? So things like that. So, yeah, we're doing the best with what data we have, but we do have a lot of data to back up. And we have a lot of data that shows that a lot of the folks who committed homicides during that period of time, 2010 to 2015, were prohibited under federal law. So if we had a state law, maybe we could have prevented those.
Thank you so much, Allison.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from MARTA. We'll hear from Rhonda Briggins. Rhonda is the Senior Director of External Affairs for the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority, or to us, MARTA. She's responsible for the Office of Government Affairs and the Office of Community Relations. She manages and oversees staff in both of these areas on a federal, state, and local level. Prior to joining MARTA, she served at the as the Southern Political Director of the White House Project, where she consulted as the political advisor for the Southern office, and also specialized in getting women elected to office by providing them with supportive services and skills. Rhonda is the Social Action Coordinator for the Stone Mountain Lithonia Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and sits on various boards here in the community. She received her bachelor's degree from Georgia State University and her Juris Doctorate from the Jones School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Rhonda Briggins.
This is going to be very fast because we've done a lot at MARTA over the last couple of years, and so when you're on the road with doing a good thing, you don't push your luck. So we won't be going for much, but I will discuss with you a few things. As you all know, last night was really great for us. We received overwhelmingly support for the passage of the MARTA half penny in the city of Atlanta at 72%. So second referendum in the last 2 years, Clayton County came in at 74%. And so I feel good about that. That's $2.5 billion over 40 years and about $60 million annually. So right before I got here, we were trying to figure out what type of services we could quickly put on the ground for you all and make sure that we are serving the citizens of the city of Atlanta. So thank you if you voted, and we really appreciate that. All of that came out of we started in the General Assembly. We've been, over the last 10 years, talking about the need for transportation and infrastructure. The year before last, through HB 170, which was the big highway bill, you passed $1 billion for roads and bridges. During that time in that conversation, all of the transit folks were saying, well, what about transit? What can we do for transit? And the state responded by giving us about $70 million for all transit systems in bund funds where they could go and ask for capital dollars, but it's very short term. And so MARTA ended up getting about $30 million of that. And so we're like, well, that still is not enough. You can't build out the system. What can we do? So last year, we proposed a piece of legislation that would allow the citizens of Fulton, DeKalb, and City of Atlanta to go in and tax themselves to really begin building out the system. So with that process, if you were down at the General Assembly, it was like being on a roller coaster. I left the General Assembly that year. They had a little pen. What's the guy? Kenny from South Park, right? So I had a Kenny pin on my lobbyist badge, and so people would come up, because one day Kenny would be up, he's good, and then the other days he's down because he's dead. So, you know, every episode Kenny dies, comes back. So that was the MARTA bill. So the MARTA bill went back and forth, and we ended with the city of Atlanta having the ability to tax themselves for a half a penny. And then you had an option within that piece of legislation that gave DeKalb County an option to also tax themselves for a half a penny. Next year, when we go back, Fulton County, from what we're hearing, Senator Brandon Beach will advance a quarter of a penny in dedicated funds from Fulton County because they decide to only go 0.75 last night, which also won. And the other quarter of penny, we would have to go back to pass legislation to have MARTA take advantage of the other piece of that SPLOST, those SPLOST dollars, to then expand whatever systems in Fulton County, which would come out a quarter of a penny. So that's on our legislative agenda. Senator Brandon Beach will be advancing that legislation, which means in 2018, those of you that live in Fulton County might have the opportunity to go back on to the polls to either vote for DeKalb County and Fulton County for another expansion of the MARTA services. It is our hope that we, over time, hopefully we could gobble enough funding together to truly begin to build out the system. When you look at the system and the creation of the MARTA system, you have WMATA in DC and you have BART in San Francisco. And MARTA, they all started at the same time. MARTA's only, I know, see? Okay, I don't have to say anything. All right, next, let me go to the next piece of legislation. That conversation's over. All right, next. Okay, sounds good. I'm ready. Also in HB 170, which is the big roads and highway bill, to get to $1 billion, they did a lot of creative math, is what I would call it. And so a part of the creative math, all of the transit systems over the years, we have had the luxury to have an exemption for our motor fuel sales tax. So to help get to the billion, they took those exemptions away from us. And so we're going to try to go back and reinstate the motor fuel sales tax exemption. That's about $3.1 million for MARTA annually. And so we're going to try our best to see if we could change that. It's going to be hard, but we'll try. The other thing, if you've been in our stations, we've been really trying to expand what we're doing around TOD and all of those things. And we also currently, we have concessions. And we're trying our best to move out. So when you go to DC, Union Station, and when you're in New York and all of those stations, they have these lovely concessions and you can buy everything and they're nice stores. So we're really pushing to get to that. But we have to have a piece of legislation that would allow us to expand our concessions program. Currently, right now, the way the procurement process or the competitive bidding process is set up, whoever has the highest bid, it doesn't matter because they're only looking at the revenues. So whoever comes with the highest bid, which then in return for us would be the highest revenues that MARTA could receive, basically could win the procurement. And so we really need to change that. We need to look at the pricing. We need to look at the type of items and merchandising that they're going to have, what type of concessions they're trying to serve up. And so we'll have more of a competitive and really things that people want, your customers want. And so we're going in trying to hopefully get that piece of legislation passed. And then we do a lot of housekeeping, as all of the organizations do, little small housekeeping things. We have 2 accounting housekeeping bills that we're also going to pass. But I do want to make mention of one more thing before I sit down, and I can take questions as well. Also last year, there were 2 study committees that were created. And those reports go in the 1st of December. So you had a House study committee looking at transit as well as a Senate study committee. And there's going to be a report released out of that. The state of Georgia is really trying to figure out what do we do with transit. Because we sit here in Atlanta, we only think of MARTA, but there's transit systems. Almost every county has a transit system. Now, they're not MARTA, they don't have the big buses and trains. A lot of them are small vans and that type of thing. But almost every county has a transit system. And so what do you do with transit as a statewide where we're really having the connectivity and the mobility for our citizens? And so we're really working very hard to come out of something, a statewide solution of how we deal with transit from a statewide perspective. And also within that process, hopefully, so everyone cross your fingers, where the state will actually make an investment, for a true and real investment in transit on a statewide perspective. And so I can take questions. That's the end of our legislative agenda, and just pray for us. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that MARTA is the only major metropolitan transit authority in the country that's not got a state line on it?
Well, we're a part of if you look at the top 10, in as far as big systems, yes. So when you look at top 10 big systems, New York, your Philadelphias, your WMATAs, all of those folks have their states make the investment in their systems, usually on the capital side and on their debt service side. So yes, with that perspective. Oh, I'm sorry. She was talking about the state investment in transit for large systems, and that the state of Georgia, that they're not making an investment in MARTA, and where in other states they do. So, yes.
My question is, what kind of barriers do you think are the hardest to cross with getting a state system in place or state funding?
You know what? Look, the crazy thing, we all at the General Assembly, the lobbyists, we're like, yes, we want money, and then we never stop to think, like, can you accept the money? So that's like the problem with a lot of systems now. Can you accept the money because if the state of Georgia gives you money, then they have to have ownership. So then how legally do you deal with the ownership piece? And so we're being very creative of getting to how do you truly have this exchange of state funding, and then the other piece is the governance. If a state makes those type of investments, then what type of governance and participation will they want to play once they put those dollars in place? And so those are the type of conversations that we're having that have been going on through the study committee that we're continuing on. And then the other thing is you have this massive MARTA, and then you have urban systems like your Columbus and Augusta and Savannah that also are growing at this time and expanding. And the thing that people forget, the big T-SPLOS failed, and with the regional T-SPLOS, remember that about in 2010? It failed here, but it passed in 3 other places. So it passed in Middle Georgia, it passed in Augusta, and it passed in Columbus. Those folks have so much money, and they're expanding their transit, and they're doing all of these amazing things. And now they've grown as far as their participation in the conversation and dialogue around what do you do from a statewide solution. So MARTA's not the only person at the table where we all think only of MARTA when you look at transit. So now you have other players. So how do you bring those players in addition to your small rural folks? So it's a lot of apple and oranges, and that we have to really get to the table and mold through to get a statewide solution where we can help everyone. That's it? All right, good. Easy crowd, easy crowd.
Next, we'll hear from Helen Robinson with the YWCA. Helen is the director of the YWCA of Greater Atlanta's Department of Advocacy and Public Policy. Helen oversees all advocacy work for the YWCA, including serving as lead trainer for the Georgia Women's Policy Institute. She has a master's degree in public affairs from Indiana University, a bachelor's in political science from Davidson College in North Carolina, and a background in strategic communications, policy advocacy, and coalition building. Please join me in welcoming Helen Robinson.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here with you tonight. In the YWCA of Greater Atlanta, we work on the health and safety and the economic empowerment of women and girls in our state. And as the Director of Advocacy, I work on state-level policy issues. We have an annual multi-issue comprehensive policy agenda that we put out every year that is proactive, positive things that we think the state of Georgia could do to improve the lives of all women and girls in our state. Then during the session, we also, of course, monitor all bills that get introduced and budgetary items, and we look at them through a gender lens. So will this have a negative or a disparate impact on women and girls, or is it a good idea, something that will help improve our lives? And so that's what we do, and we have a great partnership with your organization. All of you individually could sign up. You could go to ywcaatlanta.org georgiasoc.org and sign up for our advocacy e-newsletter and our weekly action alerts that we will send out during the session. But then also, we've had a good relationship with having Gall send out some alerts with us as well. And so we hope to be able to stay in communication with each of you during the session. And please know that you individually, with your professional background and all the things that you're involved in, have a lot of influence at the state capitol. But I also think there's just something amazing about saying the Georgia Association of Women Lawyers is behind this that I think gets attention. And I really encourage you to use your power during the session for whatever issues your organization ends up being behind. And so there will be some crossover in what's on our 2017 agenda with some of the organizations that are here today, because again, we look comprehensively across the board at things that'll move during the session that would impact women. And we also bring together a lot of the organizations that you'll hear from in our Women and Girls Policy Stakeholder Roundtable, which meets quarterly to basically collaborate and figure out what we think can move. And so I know you'll be hearing from GBPI in just a minute, but we will have on our agenda a state-level earned income tax credit, which is something that could help remove barriers to self-sufficiency for women, low-income working women in our state. And we think that they could use that credit for housing, transportation, and childcare, for example, and help them move up to the middle class. That's under our economic empowerment pillar. Another economic empowerment issue that we will work on again this year is called the Family Care Act. This has been around for a while, so you're probably familiar with it. But this is a bill which would enable working women, who, as we all know, most often serve as primary caregivers in the home, to use already earned sick days to care for their sick children or their elderly parents. So it does not create the sick days or require that they be paid. It's just what they already have can be used flexibly for their child care or their elder care responsibilities. And there's a coalition working very hard on that bill called the Georgia Job Family Collaborative, which we're a member of. We will also be working again to expand access to quality, affordable early learning and childcare. This is also something GBPI works on. We know that working mothers, one of the biggest challenges they can have economically is how to pay for childcare. And while we have a subsidy program in our state, it serves just a tiny fraction of the women who actually need it. And also we need to look at increasing the amount of the subsidies as well. So that's a budgetary issue. There's also going to be a repeat of a bill that you may have seen last year to allow preventive dental services, or basically cleanings, to be done for underserved and vulnerable populations in safety net settings by a dental hygienist without the direct in-person supervision of a dentist. And so we are also working with a coalition to support that again this year and see if that might possibly be able to make it through. And another that's a health-related issue. Another health and safety-related issue that we are looking at is maternal mortality and infant mortality. You know, unfortunately, every year data comes out and it just is never good for our state. And there's really no reason why we shouldn't be able to improve that data. And so we're looking at a couple of options for that. And one example is last year, some state funding was dedicated to crisis pregnancy centers, and we want to see a bill that might help actually ensure that there are some medical standards and some correct medical information being given at those centers when women go to them to help ensure that they do have a healthy pregnancy if they continue it. On the health and safety pillar, we also work on human trafficking, and I'm very happy to say that Amendment Number 2 passed overwhelmingly in the state of Georgia. Last time I checked, I think 83% of voters voted in favor of the Safe Harbor Amendment, so give yourselves a round of applause. I'm assuming you all voted for it, but thank you. And as you all know, that came out of a more comprehensive bill that passed a couple of years ago, which one thing it did was it provided greater a greater affirmative defense for the girls, or and sometimes boys, who are caught in human trafficking, so that they would not be treated as criminals, but they would be given services which they need as victims. And the other part of that was this idea that you also have to have some funding to actually make sure there are places for them to go when they are rescued from their traffickers. And so that's what Amendment 2 does, and we'll be very happy to watch the implementation of that, including the creation of a state commission, which will oversee how the funds are used. The GCADV's bill will absolutely be on our policy agenda for obvious reasons. And then the last thing is, as you all know, because you partnered with us on this, we passed a bill called the Pursuing Justice for Rape Victims Act last session. And so there might be other sexual assault related issues that we'll want to take up. There are a couple of things being considered. Representative Scott Holcomb, who was the sponsor of that bill last session, is currently looking at a bill that would increase penalties if your victim was unconscious or incapacitated, which is something that unfortunately we've heard a lot about in the media with cases. Also, you may remember that a few months ago, the AJC was talking about this issue called upskirting, which actually I had never heard of the term because I'm not really hip. But apparently people use their phones to take video up strangers' skirts. And so I do suspect that we'll see a bill about that. I don't know who the sponsor might be yet, but we'll be monitoring that one. You all should also know that there have been some administrative changes made by the Board of Regents for sexual assault cases on campuses in the university system in our state. Those changes were made due to some pressure from the legislature, and they basically make it harder for a woman to successfully bring a complaint on her campus. And so we are looking at that very carefully and trying to decide what possibilities there are that we could do something about that, and at least possibly just raise awareness, because women do deserve to know that these changes were made, and a lot of them, I don't think they do know that. So that is it for now, and when we have our final agenda, I will make sure that I share it with this group, and I can't wait to work with you during the session. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
On the dental bill you mentioned that was put forward previously, what is the opposition?
The dentist opposed it. Good. Any other questions? Thank you all.
Great, thank you. Next, we'll hear from Taifa Smith Butler of the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Taifa is the Executive Director of GBBI, and as the Executive Director, she provides the organization of vision, inspiration, and strategic management. She provides leadership and guidance to accomplish GBPI's mission and vision to improve economic opportunity for all Georgians. She has more than 20 years of experience in strategic communications, public policy research, and data analysis in the public, nonprofit, and private sectors. Taifa was an education policy fellow with the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education's Class of 2009 Education Policy Fellowship Program and is a graduate of the Georgia Academy for Economic Development. She holds a bachelor's in politics and economics from Mount Holyoke College and a master's in public management and policy from the Hines School of Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. Please welcome Taifa Butler.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to join you all tonight to talk a little bit about what's hot coming up in this 2017 legislative session. First of all, Georgia Budget and Policy Institute is a nonprofit research organization focused on increasing economic opportunity for all Georgians. And one of our ultimate goals is really to build a more inclusive economy in our state where everyone can participate and thrive. And if you are in any particular area in this state, you know opportunity is not readily available nor accessible to people depending on their zip code and where they live, and oftentimes their income and the color of their skin. So I'm just put that out there. So one of the things that we try to do is to really address those issues and the barriers that exist to those opportunities. So a couple of things for you all to keep in mind during this upcoming legislative session. One of the biggest things that was on the docket is on the docket. We're not quite sure what's going to happen with this, given what happened at 3 a.m. this morning with the election, is Medicaid expansion. One of the things that we have been advocating for the last couple of years is for Georgia to seize the opportunity to provide more health care access to more than 300,000 individuals who right now fall in the coverage gap, given the ACA, the Affordable Care Act legislation. And for the longest time, our state leaders have been opposed to doing that. We've often made the case that it is an imperative that we provide health care access for families. It's an economic development indicator. It's an indicator of quality of life. And as we talk about Georgia being the #1 place to do business, one of the things we need is a healthy workforce. And when we have more than 500,000 people who don't have insurance, but also this 300,000 families or individuals who can't quite get insurance on the marketplace and make too much to get access to the Medicaid program, we have some decisions to make about how to address that. And again, we've made the case that we can afford it. So given the new landscape federally, we're not quite sure where Georgia will go. The State Chamber of Commerce and the Georgia Hospital Association offered a proposal that has several options. Next week, Tuesday at 10 a.m., there was a meeting scheduled of the Premium Assistance Study Committee that was actually going to be looking at this plan. As of today, not quite sure if that meeting will still be held, given the new environment which we're in, given the federal and the campaign to perhaps not go forward with the Affordable Care Act. So that's on standby as far as we're concerned. If Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act is not the vehicle, then we need to regroup and come back to how do we address this challenge that has been facing so many families in this state for a long, long time. So that's one. Number two is the Education Reform Commission that the governor had convened last year. That commission met for nearly a year and a half, developing some recommendations around school readiness, around quality child care, around reforming or revising the school funding formula. There was also a segment of that reform commission that looked at Move On When Ready. How do we continue to get more young people moving into higher education more quickly? And then there was also a committee that focused on teacher compensation. Well, our organization has been focused on the funding formula for a long time now. For the last several years, we've written several reports around the fact that our funding for local schools has been, quite frankly, underfunded for the last 14 years. We have been as we've called it, austerity cuts. Local schools have not gotten the funding that they've earned. And so there's been a concerted effort over the last couple of years from the governor's office to reduce that austerity cut. And in this fiscal year, 2017, which ends June 30th of 2017, schools are underfunded about $166 million. There is an intent, we believe, to fully fund the current formula. So when the next legislative budget drops second week in January from the governor's office, we believe, based on those Education Reform Commission recommendations, that formula will be fully funded and perhaps get some additional dollars. But the new formula itself, as it's been derived, we believe shortchanges schools long term. And so there's some recommendations we've made in our recent brief that's on our website called Student Success in the Balance Update 2017. Please make sure you check out our website. But we highlight about 4 areas in the new funding formula that we think need to be changed or fixed. One of those is the fact, and this is wonky, but it's important when you think about Georgia as one of the fastest growing states in the nation, that the new formula does not adjust for inflation. So pretty much it's flat funding into perpetuity. 2, it builds in the transportation grants that school systems get right now, and this is particularly of concern for rural systems who spend a lot more of their dollars with transit and transporting students on buses. That funding for transportation, which again is underfunded, but that is built into the base of the school funding formula, and that again will shortchange districts long term. The third part of this formula that we think needs to be addressed is the fact that there are certain weights built into the new formula that categorizes students in a certain way and then provides additional funding for students who are poor, who need additional supports. We know what the research says, right, around students who are economically disadvantaged need to be educated in smaller classrooms. They need more quality teachers with more experience in front of the classrooms. They need more supports and wraparound services in those schools. So we know that's what the research says, right? But we are concerned that this new formula will shortchange those students significantly. Right now, we count or recognize students who are economically disadvantaged by looking at free and reduced lunch. And right now, that's about 62% of the students in K-12 schools today are considered economically disadvantaged. With the new formula, because of the way the federal government has changed the calculation for free and reduced lunch, now school systems who have a certain percentage of those students who are eligible can go to a school-wide eligibility. And so that you lose now the real true count of the number of students. So now the state is saying, since we can't use that because there's too much noise in those data, we're going to look at the eligibility of our public benefits programs, SNAP, TANF, as sort of the indicator. Well, for those of you who follow our public benefits programs, the state eligibility is very, very low because the state has limited those support systems or services for families. And so we go from now 62% of families or students who are economically disadvantaged. In this new formula, it cuts that in half to about 32%. So when you talk about weighting students in poverty, we want to make sure that the dollars are there, right, for those schools to have to educate those children who need additional support. Well, right now that calculation does not count them well, and so we want that addressed also in the formula. So those are, I mentioned 3, there's about 4, but you can read our report for more. I don't want to take up too much time, but that's another big piece that will be moving forward. And also, if you've watched the General Assembly at all, you know the governor stood up last year and vetoed 2 bills, right? He vetoed the Religious Freedom bill and the gun bill, and that created some tension, I think, in the General Assembly. And let my hair down a little bit and say that because we think, there's some political capital that may have been lost. And so this next session, last 2 years of his legacy and his agenda, whether or not those big items will move, is called into question. So the Education Reform Commission effort, and also we know that the Medicaid expansion and the fact that in order to fund Medicaid, the legislature will be looking at revising the hospital bed tax, which has been used to help fund the Medicaid program. And the hospitals will definitely be advocating for that revision of that funding source. They've agreed to deal with it because they need more, or I would say higher reimbursement rates for those who are providers of Medicaid. So those are two big items. Helen already mentioned child care subsidies. That is one thing that we've often talked about, again, as a way to help families. If you think about the families who are most in need in our state are often headed by female households. And so how do we help women work and be more financially and economically secure? Child care support and subsidies are a way to do that. And from public policy can facilitate that. But we know right now the department is not moving forward with the additional budget requests for child care subsidies. So that's one thing that could be a budget ask this legislative session. What I have in front of you is something that GDPI is moving forward with more of, is laying out some positives. Well, we do this all the time, but this is packaged in a nice way in terms of an agenda. And so we developed an economic opportunity agenda for Georgia women that has 4 pillars in it. One of them is minimum wage. Women are oftentimes the individuals or workers who are often getting minimum wage or would mostly benefit from an increase in minimum wage. And one thing we do say about pay parity, if women earn the same amount of their male counterparts, $14 billion would be added to Georgia's economy. What would that do to our state if we just moved on that one issue? Child care subsidies is highlighted in this report. A Medicaid expansion is another way to help women and families be more economically secure, and also the Earned Income Tax Credit as another means to help families. Thank you so much, and if there's anything you need to know more of, go to gdpi.org, and we have a ton of resources and research out there that can help you. Thank you. Questions?
Next, we're going to hear from a representative of Greenlaw. David Pauley, I hope I'm saying that correctly, is the Executive Director of Greenlaw, an experienced marketing executive, fundraiser, writer, and educator. He specializes in global business turnarounds and building greenfield organizations. He joined Greenlaw in May of 2016. Previously, he served as Chief Revenue Officer of the Atlanta Opera, where he led marketing, communications, and development. Formerly, Dave worked at Delta Airlines as the marketing head for Delta Cargo, the company's $1.1 billion air freight division. Dave is a member of the faculty of Georgia State University's J. Mack Robinson School of Business, where he teaches the managerial science curriculum. In his spare time, he is a novelist, publishing stories under the name D.M. Pauley. He also has prior experience in photography, broadcasting, video production, and stand-up comedy. He holds a Master of Business Administration from Georgia State University and a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Cincinnati. Whew. He lives in Atlanta. Please welcome David Pauley.
I know what you're all thinking. Every good law firm needs a stand-up comic. And you can tell by the introduction, I didn't realize I sent you the long form one. I'm not typically classified as focused. Thank you all for inviting me to be here. I'm been aware of Gall's work for a while. I'm very supportive. I also brought with me Adriana Jaume, member of my team, who as of 2 weeks ago is one of Georgia's newest women attorneys. Greenlaw is for those of you who don't know of us, we're a 501c3 law firm that advances environmental justice through clean air, clean energy, clean water and coastal defense, and responsible land use. We were formed 25 years ago by Ralph Nader as a 501c3 to provide pro bono law services to Georgia's environmental nonprofits and conservation groups, because there is no money in plaintiffs' work for environmental law. There's a lot of money to be paid defending the polluters, not so much going after them. And as Veronica said, I joined Greenlaw 6 months ago next week, so you forgive me, I'm working from notes. We have 4 things that are important to us in the coming session, and I'm going to touch on one of them in detail and the other 3 briefly. We've got one piece of legislation that we're pushing, 2 things that we're fighting, and a constitutional amendment that we are considering. The piece of legislation we're fighting, we're pushing forward, is the fight against unfair use of eminent domain practices to confiscate land to build pipelines through Georgia to benefit out-of-state corporations. We've had a lot of history and background and success fighting pipelines. Earlier this year, we defeated the Palmetto Pipeline, which was going to go through 23 counties in the eastern half of the state. The reason we're fighting it is not so much that we're necessarily against eminent domain per se. Lots of great things are accomplished through eminent domain, like building mass transit systems. The issue within Georgia is that eminent domain can be used to seize land on the behalf of out-of-state corporations. And pipelines in particular are somewhat egregious about this. So if eminent domain is used to build pipelines through your property, company will come in, you'll be paid fair market value for the land. You actually do not lose title or ownership to the land. The pipeline runs through your land. You can no longer build anything on that piece of land or plant anything on it, but you still have to pay property taxes on it. And as Colonial Pipeline has done a nice job of demonstrating for me 2 months in a row, pipelines are dangerous things. Separate from the legislation, we're fighting a natural gas pipeline that's supposed to run through western Georgia. It's called the Sable Trail Pipeline. It will not benefit Georgia in any way economically. It's going to be built through some of the most geographically unstable land in Georgia. In fact, it's going to run right over the water supply for the city of Augusta, with a pumping station built in the the backyard of Augusta's oldest and largest historically African American church. And there'll be no economic benefit for us. Last year, we won a temporary moratorium on the building of natural gas pipelines, largely because of the Palmetto work. So a commission can be formed to study the issue. It's a bipartisan commission. It's been very responsive to us, so we are writing legislation right now that at a minimum will severely curtail and write a lot of constraints on when eminent domain can be used to take land. We're going to, our first play is we'll go after trying to ban the use of eminent domain for this kind of seizure. The other, one of the two things that we're going to be fighting is buffer legislation. That Georgia harbors the 1/3 of all of the salt marsh that remains on the East Coast. And Georgia islands and real estate are largely undeveloped, largely protected, and developers hate that. That if you look at development up and down the coast, Georgia remains one of the last areas of largely pristine wilderness. For about 40 years, there was a piece of legislation called the Georgia's Erosion and Sedimentation Act of 1975, which basically created a 25-foot buffer to protect construction on marshland, on coastal land, on waterways. In 2014, part of that law was thrown out, so we had to bring together a coalition of nonprofit environmental groups to get it put back into place. We were successful in 2015. In 2016, we had to fight legislation this time to remove the 25-foot barrier on Georgia's streams and rivers. We were successful fighting that one. We're expecting them to come back again this year and advance some other form of legislation to essentially allow construction right up to the waterfront. Most of Georgia's water pollution is actually not a function of industrial runoff. We have some, especially down around Glenn County. It's more a function of runoff of construction, because we love to build sediment and runoff chemicals and pollution from construction are what most damages our waterways, especially in North Georgia. The other thing that we're going to fight is the Camden County Spaceport. You heard Veronica say I'm an aerospace engineer. One of the things I can tell you is that when you build launch facilities, you want to build them in such a way that if the rocket blows up or falls out of the air, it doesn't hit anyone or anything. The Camden County Spaceport is planned to basically shoot rockets directly over Cumberland Island. It will require the evacuation of Cumberland anytime a rocket is shot off. If one exploded on takeoff, as they are known to do, then it would actually spread pollution up and down most of the coastal isles. And then the last thing that's under consideration is a constitutional amendment to require state government that when they impose a tax or a special purpose fee, that the tax or special purpose fee actually be applied or paid out to what it's being imposed for. So, for example, if you've ever had new tires put on your car in the state of Georgia, you have to pay a tire recycling fee. That fee does not go directly to tire recycling. It gets paid into the general fund, and then tire recycling has to be budgeted as a separate line item. And largely from what we've seen of all special environmental fees, they get budgeted for far less than is collected and paid into the general fund. We're still shopping around to decide whether or not we've got the appetite to attack that. I'm brand new. I'm yelling, go, go, go. My legal director is an attorney. He's going, shut up, shut up, shut up. So that, in a nutshell, is everything Greenlaw is going to push for short term. Are there any questions? Yes.
Where was the Palmetto pipeline going to be?
So the question is where was the Palmetto Pipeline going to be? The Palmetto Pipeline was going to come through North Carolina and run basically from Charleston all the way down through counties on the East Coast, through 4 protected watersheds, most significantly the Altamaha River. And it was not going to carry any fuel into Georgia or employ anyone in Georgia. It was going to carry everything into Florida. The Sable Trail one that we are also fighting is going to come through Alabama. It's going to carry fracked gas, also not for benefit of Georgia, also into Florida. Other questions? Well, great. Thank you all so much for having me here.
Next, we'll hear from Georgia Watch. Sharon Harris is an attorney at the Harris Firm, which is a general practice law firm. She's on the board of directors of Georgia Watch, the state's leading consumer advocacy organization. On behalf of Georgia Watch, she speaks at community forums like this as a part of the organization's community education initiative. She serves as the chair of the Judicial Review Committee with the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. She is also a graduate of Gall EDU program. She serves on the executive committee for the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy and on the State Bar of Georgia's Solis and Business Court committees. Her other activities include being a 2014 graduate of the Yale Women's Campaign School, a sustaining member of the Junior League of Atlanta. She serves on the United Way of Greater Atlanta's Income Community Investment, and she's a 2017 fellow with the YWCA of Greater Atlanta, Georgia Women's Policy Institute with Helen Robinson. Please welcome Sharon Harris.
I didn't want to hold you if I was the last person, but I think you guys got more people. Again, I'm Sharon Harris, and I'm a board member with Georgia Watch, the state's leading consumer advocacy agency. And I am also a Gall member, as Veronica mentioned, so I'm excited to share with you the good work that we do at Georgia Watch and what we plan for this year's legislative session. So Georgia Watch has 4 key program areas in healthcare, financial protection, civil justice, and in consumer energy and utilities. And under these areas, healthcare, our goal is to advocate for affordable, safe, accessible healthcare for all Georgians. In the energy and utility space, we are advocating for affordable and efficient energy and utilities, and we represent the interest of Georgia consumers before the Georgia Public Service Commission. So we submit filings, attend hearings, and provide testimony regarding rate adjustments and cost overruns. In the civil justice program area, We advocate for consumer accessibility to courts. And then within the financial protection space, we ensure that safeguard protections are in place for Georgia consumers for issues that impact their wallets and quality of life. And this includes things like identity theft, housing foreclosures, as well as predatory lending. So for 2017, we actually have a very long list of things that we're supporting and introducing. It's about 16 items on our agenda, so I'll only highlight a few. Some of them have already been mentioned by other organizations here that we will be supporting or partnering with. So in the healthcare space, we plan to continue to support legislation to curtail surprise medical billing. And Georgia Watch will be having a lunch webinar next Wednesday, November the 16th, to talk about surprise medical billing. So if you can participate, if you go to georgiawatch.org, you can register there for our webinar. Also, we will be supporting the dental hygienist bill. As Helen mentioned, we've been supporting that bill since about 2015, and it's just very helpful for individuals in rural areas who don't have access to dental hygienists to have basic preventative dental services. And so allowing dental hygienists to provide the service would be very helpful for those in remote areas. And we're going to continue to support closing the coverage gap for Medicaid expansion, and Taifa mentioned that as well. In the finance area, we're going to continue to monitor potential legislation by debt settlement companies to seek to remove the current fee caps against debt settlement services. So we don't anticipate any legislation, but if any comes up from any debt settlement services, we'll continue to monitor that in order to advocate against those debt settlement services trying to remove that cap. We're also going to introduce legislation ourselves to address the lack of training and oversight in the tax preparation industry. So Georgia Watch, earlier this year, we released findings from a secret shopper survey or secret shopper investigation that we did in the Southwest Atlanta area. And when doing that, we found that the study showed us that after almost every scenario, there were discrepancies and inaccuracies at a lot of the major tax preparers for the same individual. So we will be advocating for some type of regulation around the tax preparation industry in order to assist individuals in low-income areas which have a disparate impact of individuals when preparing their taxes. We're also going to defend against title pawn and small loan provider legislation who seek to weaken existing state usury limits. So the CFPB is currently enacting regulations around the title pawn industry on the federal level, but we found that in order to curtail that, many of the title pawn shops or people in the title pawn industry are trying to curtail that by going to the state level and kind of going around legislation that seeks to weaken existing usury limits. And then finally, in the finance area, we will support EITC legislation or Georgia Work Credit. And Taifa, she did mention that GBPI is a leader in that legislation, and as a GWPI fellow, I also work with Helen's group at the YWCA, who's also a partner around that legislation. So hopefully with the amount of attention and the coalition around EITC, we can see some movement in this upcoming session. Finally, in our consumer energy space, we plan to introduce legislation to seek greater transparency for electricity membership cooperatives. So in rural areas, power is provided by electricity cooperatives, and they are governed by a local board. And so similar to, I guess, what a corporate board would be for Georgia Power, in rural areas, the local boards govern power for in the rural areas, but they are not subject to the same laws and restrictions as corporate power providers. So we are seeking legislation for more transparency for these electricity membership cooperatives. We will continue to support clean and affordable solar energy. And then finally, we plan to introduce legislation that will amend the Georgia Nuclear Finance Act and to limit the collection of nuclear construction cost recovery tariffs. So that particular issue is kind of large and complex, and we've worked on that for a while. If you have questions, I can put you in touch with an expert. I am not that person. But I thank you very much, and that is Georgia Watch's legislative agenda for the 2017 session. Are there any questions? Oh, thank you very much.
Next, we're going to hear from Project South. Azadeh Shashahani brings over 10 years of experience in anti-Islamophobia work and defense of human rights in the immigrant justice movement and global movements for liberation, such as in Palestine, Philippines, and Tunisia. Her work at Project South has launched new programming based in local, regional, and global initiatives. Azadeh has worked in North Carolina and Georgia to protect the human rights of immigrants and Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. She's a recent past president of the National Lawyers Guild and previously served as National Security and Immigrants' Rights Project Director with the ACLU of Georgia. Please join me in welcoming Azadeh Shashahani.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. So Project South has been around for 30 years. We are based in Atlanta, but we work in the entire US South. And as you heard in the introductions, we also do a little bit of work with the Global South. And we primarily actually work with grassroots social justice movements. So leadership training, popular education, and other work. And so my role specifically as legal and advocacy director is to provide legal support to social justice movements. And specifically, I work with immigrants and Muslim communities. And I started in January with Project South. So in terms of the upcoming legislative session, we are going to try to defeat the anti-immigrant bills that they will be throwing at us, as the legislature has, unfortunately, for the past several years. The nature of the bills might differ this year a little bit because, at least for the past several years, everything that has come out of the legislative session, or at least most of the bills, have been trying to go in opposition to the Obama administration. In light of what happened last night, we might not see that much of that anymore. For example, last year and in previous years, we had a measure trying to take driver's licenses away from deferred action grantees, and that's a program that President Obama had put into effect. Now, that whole program might unfortunately come to an end. I have to say, it pains me to even say this, but it's true. So, unfortunately, the deferred action recipients might not be entitled to, to getting any type of reprieve from deportation anymore. In the past, though, what happened was that those folks, DACA grantees, were able to get driver's licenses and work permits. And so the Georgia legislature was trying to put a stop to that. So 1 year, a bill was basically going to take driver's licenses away from them as a whole, and then the sponsor of the bill basically realized that he can't do that, and even the Attorney General of Georgia came out and said that per federal law, these deferred action grantees, like other deferred action grantees, need to have driver's licenses. So then they changed the measure a little bit, saying that those driver's licenses should look different basically like scarlet letters. They should, be, they should have some designation on it so that the person holding it is clear that they're not like the rest of us. They're kind of different because they're, they're deferred action grantees. So as I said, if the program as a whole comes to an end, then there is no need for that legislation anymore. We might also see some type of legislation attacking refugees. So in the past, in the Georgia legislature, obviously, there was a pecking order for immigrants with refugees being at the top and undocumented immigrants being at the bottom. Until the refugees became Muslim, so from Syria and other countries, and unfortunately we saw Governor Deal advancing a proposal to make it harder for the agencies in Georgia to resettle refugees. Again, an initiative advanced by the Obama administration. And again, Attorney General came out and said that, well, you can't really do that. So Governor Deal withdrew that. So, we might see something of that sort in the Georgia legislature, but then again, there might not be a need for that if the federal government kind of puts a stop altogether to admitting of refugees. So again, it remains to be seen. We are ready to continue to monitor the developments at the Georgia legislature. We are hopefully going to have a lobby day pushing specifically for immigrants' rights issues. And so please, watch out, and we need all of your support, obviously, as lawyers and as people who care about human rights and immigrants' rights. I should also mention that we work as a part of a coalition, the Georgia Not One More Coalition, that works on the local level to try to advance immigrants' rights, specifically getting localities to basically limit their collaboration with ICE. And this actually has particular pertinence to women and any survivor of violence, because if you are a survivor of violence, obviously you need to be able to trust the police to go to them and tell them about any violence that you may have suffered. When the police and ICE have agreements to collaborate very closely, that trust diminishes to a huge extent. And so basically victims of violence and witnesses to violence are much less likely to go to the police if they know that going to the police might mean that they would be placed in deportation proceedings. So the Georgia Not One More Coalition has been trying to push for policies at the local level to get the police to declare that at least they're not going to extend the detention of immigrants that have placed bonds and otherwise are eligible for release. And so far we've had victories in 4 counties, so in Fulton, Clayton, DeKalb, and most recently Fayette counties. The sheriffs have come out with policies at least limiting their collaboration with ICE. And so we hope to continue to go around the state and get more sheriffs to adopt those policies. So please check out our website, projectsouth.org, and hopefully we'll see some not so bad news out of the legislature this year. Any questions or comments? Yes.
What was the name of your campaign? Was it not one more?
Georgia Not One More, meaning Not One More Deportation. We work closely with a national coalition called the basically Not One More campaign. Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much.
Certainly not least of our organizations, we have the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association. Today we have with us Madeline Simmons. Madeline is a partner in the law firm of Morgan & Morgan and practices personal injury litigation. She's tried over 25 personal injury jury trials and is passionate about the 7th Amendment and our right to civil justice. She serves on GTLA's executive board and is the chair of GTLA's award-winning magazine, The Verdict. Madeline is also a board member of Georgia's Civil Justice Political Action Committee. In her free time, she enjoys volunteering and spending time with her husband and family, which includes 2 fluffy dogs. Please join me in welcoming Madeline Simmons.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Gall. I'm happy to be here on behalf of the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association. You heard a little bit about it in my bio, but what the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association is it is a group of trial lawyers across the state where our goal is to protect the citizens' right to civil justice and to protect our rights under the Seventh Amendment, which is a right to a trial by jury. What I'm going to be talking with you all about tonight are not necessarily things that we are going to be pushing this next legislative session, but more so threats that we see coming down the path, that we often see coming down the path, that we're going to be monitoring and fighting against if they do get to the points of being bills this session. The first one being the erosion of the collateral source rule. So what does that mean? Well, currently in Georgia, if you, and I'll use a car wreck scenario so that it's kind of easy to understand. If you have a car wreck case and you're the plaintiff, you're the injured party, you're bringing the case against the defendant, they're the wrongdoer, the jury doesn't get to hear if the defendant has car insurance or not. That's not admissible. The jury also doesn't get to hear whether or not the plaintiff, the injured person, has health insurance or Medicaid or Medicare, or does not have health insurance or Medicaid or Medicare. So there's a charge that the jury hears that we're looking at two equal parties here. No one gets to hear about whether or not there's insurance. The reality is most people know that it's, state law to have state minimum car insurance. And probably 50% of the time you have a plaintiff that has health insurance. But what the collateral source rule is, it is the rule that says a jury doesn't get to hear about whether or not someone has that health insurance or that Medicaid or Medicare. There are folks that want to eliminate that rule. So why does that matter? And what I'd like to do is get a little bit interactive so that you guys can understand more how this has a negative impact on our rights. So I want us all to pretend that we're a jury, and we're a jury hearing two car wreck cases. And I'm going to pick on my friends a little bit. We've got Lisa in the front. Lisa's our injured plaintiff. We're the jury, and we get her bill, her medical bill, and it's $2,000, okay? We also hear the case of Sherwin. She's our other plaintiff. She's our other injured party. We're the jury, we get her bill. It's $200,000. Who do we think is more injured? Probably Sherwin, right? Because a jury is looking at the amount of that bill and relating that to the severity of the injuries. Well, come to find out, Lisa's bill was $200,000 too. But now, because the collateral source rule has been abolished, all the jury gets is the bill that says $2,000, which is what her health insurance had to pay. They don't get to hear that she also had injuries so bad that it created a $200,000 bill. Now, obviously, in a trial like this, you're going to present what the plaintiff went through, what their actual medical diagnoses are, but the reality at the end of the day is that jurors do put value and look at severity of injuries based on the bills that they see. So if the collateral source rule is abolished, it creates an inaccurate picture, oftentimes of the severity of the injuries and how bad the person was injured and the medical procedures that they had to undergo and the cost of those medical procedures. The other issue with the collateral source rule is that in most private health insurance contracts, it has a provision in there that says if you get hurt and you use our insurance for your medical care, and then you get compensated by a third party, the wrongdoer, the car insurance, the verdict, if you get compensated, you have to kick back a piece to us. Now, whether or not you have to kick back a piece to us often depends on how that insurance contract is written and whether or not it is an ERISA contract with federal issues that you have to look at, and whether or not the person has been made whole by the verdict. So if collateral source is abolished and the jury gets to hear about health insurance, what we see happening is a whole side trial where a jury is having to look at this issue of the validity of the health insurance contract and what they have to be paid back and whether or not they need to be paid back and what percentage they're going to be paid back, which really is not what the triers of fact are doing in a tort case. So that's something that we're very closely watching. Another one that we have heard that could be coming down the path, and this has come up before, is the elimination of jury trials in medical malpractice cases. So right now, medical malpractice cases, if you are injured by a doctor because they have not met the standard of care, they leave a sponge in you or whatever it is, you can file a case against them and the plaintiff has their expert. Yeah, Dr. Bob shouldn't have left a sponge in you, and they've got their expert. Oh, well, it wasn't that bad and you're okay, and Dr. Bob did nothing wrong. And the jury gets to hear that and they get to weigh that testimony and they get to make a decision. What we have heard is that they're pushing for an elimination of the right to a jury trial in these cases and instead creating an administrative panel of healthcare professionals and doctors who get to decide that. So, of course, we don't see that as fair as jurors holding medical professionals accountable if the folks who are holding them accountable is their buddy that plays golf with them at the country club. So that's something that we're looking at closely as well. The last one that I'll talk about, and there's several things that we're monitoring in this upcoming session, but the last one that I'll talk about is legislation that would permit Georgia employers to opt out of our workers' compensation system. So most of you all probably know how workers' compensation works is it's a no-fault system. So if you're working in the cafeteria at the school and you walk and you slip on some peaches on the ground and you hurt your back, your employer is going to let you go to the employer doctors. If you have to miss time from work, there's a fee schedule. You can only get so much per week that you're out. But the goal is to try to get you that medical treatment and get you back to work or maybe get you back to light duty. Because we have that system, there is what's called the exclusive remedy for employees, meaning they can only go through workers' comp. They can't sue their employer in tort, where they're asking for punitive damages or pain and suffering damages in these unlimited amounts. Your option is to sue your employer through the workers' comp system, and it works for both sides. Both sides have some issues, but it generally works. There is legislation going on in other parts of the country where employers are getting to opt out of the workers' comp system, meaning they don't have to provide workers' comp for their employees, but they also are still enjoying the immunity of not being able to be sued in tort. So we see that as something very bad for Georgia workers because most folks that go out on workers' comp, they're not making very much per week because of how the schedule is. They just want to get back to work. So we look at that as something that could be very dangerous to the workers' comp system and to Georgians' ability to get back to work when they are injured. I could keep talking about everything that we're watching, but I know I'm the last speaker, so I'm wrapping up with that. But if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm happy to answer them. Yes?
Do you know if your organization is going to take a position or pursue the changing the long arm statute?
I have not been privy to whether or not that's something we're going to be looking at. I haven't heard that we are, but that doesn't mean that there could be folks that are talking about that. And her question was whether or not Georgia Trial Lawyers is going to be involved in any changes to the long arm statute. It's something that affects our practices, so I wouldn't be surprised if we do get involved in that. But like I said, I haven't heard anything about it yet. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Madeline. Let's just take a moment to thank all of our organizations for coming and speaking with us tonight. So I know it's almost time to go, but I want to bring up Annie Jordan, who is the Vice President of Communications. She's going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about our legislative update program. We are working with, Public Affairs is working with Communications to bring this opportunity and program for our members.
Thanks, Veronica. So basically, we're doing Gall at the Gold Dome again this year, which is an update program that brings you all the information that you need to take the action throughout the session. I know I'm pretty excited about the legislation that I've heard about here tonight. So we want to make it easy for you to harness that excitement into something that actually gets results for us. Last year, we were elated when we saw passage of the Pursuing Justice for Rape Victims Act, which we followed throughout the session. And I can't wait to see what we get to do this year. So in the back, there are cards with all the information you need to sign up for Gall at the Gold Dome. You can get updates through email summaries every week, real-time updates on social media, and basically we will be watching the legislature throughout the session to see what happens to what you've seen here tonight. So please pick up a card, and if you have an idea of something that you want us to follow, please let us know, and we may be letting all of our members know what you are interested in. So thanks, guys.
I want to take this opportunity to once again thank our exclusive sponsor, Troutman Sanders, and also to thank you for coming and hearing all about the legislative agendas of the organizations that fall in line with Gall's mission. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.